Yeah. How did you reconcile that? Like what was the process to getting to the point where you're like, okay, I need to take a beat. This is how this industry works. Like what was sort of your modus operandi during that transition, I guess, in your career?
Um, so it was very much, I need to learn from the best person that will have me. And that's why I think Brian was for me an inspirational figure as an investor. And someone who I continue to value as a friend and mentor, and someone who, having never actually been able to directly work for him, has always been sort of a regret in my career. Is that I was very, very fortunate. Lightning struck twice in this case, where Don Frail was building a group at AstraZeneca that was focused on drug repurposing, and took a flyer on me. He was coming over from Pfizer, building a group that was a reorganization of an existing structure within AstraZeneca, very experienced drug developers, PhD drug developers, and a few MDs as well. And he took a flyer on hiring me, who had absolutely zero industry experience, and the only one in the group that had zero industry experience.
Hmm.
But what I thought to myself at the time was, okay, this isn't venture, which is where I thought I would end up, but I am going to learn how to develop a drug from these individuals, from Don and from the team at AstraZeneca. And so my solution to that problem, and that conflict was try to align myself with the best in the business.
Yeah, it's a beautiful segue, Rahul. You just gave me the most beautiful segue because in in my digging, right, like my PI work before I got on the phone with you, I found your title at AstraZeneca. And I love the way you put it. Don sort of like scooped you up and said, "Hey, here's a place for you to to get some footing while you get your family started and decide whether you want to practice for the rest of your life."
Mhm.
Um, You were Director for Emerging Innovations, Scientific Partnering, and Alliances. That's probably a one of a kind title, right? Like you're talking about the position that you were working your way into there as being sort of a first of its kind position, and that sounds like a title that's given to someone who's like, hey, this is a first of its kind position. What did that all mean? What were you doing?
Yeah, AstraZeneca was building a drug repurposing group, which basically means a group that was tasked with looking at all the molecules across the portfolio of the organization. And we really had a broad remit, molecules that were parked, molecules that were still active, and looking orthogonally, which is to say, if a drug like the drug we spun out, the anti-IL-6, Medi-5117, it was in the MedImmune portfolio, which obviously MedImmune was acquired by AstraZeneca several years ahead of this, was active in development for rheumatoid arthritis. And, partly based on my interest in inflammatory mechanisms of cardiovascular disease, myself and another scientist thought, wow, this molecule might be really interesting for cardiovascular disease. And we did some preclinical work. We had some budget to do mouse studies and to retrospectively analyze some of the large cardiovascular trials that AstraZeneca had run, and to form this hypothesis around, could IL-6 be an interesting cardiovascular drug?
Mhm.
But that's really what this group was designed to do. It was designed to look at molecules that were in the portfolio and find indications and diseases which were rational, but never originally envisioned by the scientists that developed the drug in the first place. And we had several successes of drugs that showed positive phase two data. I think the flaw in the ointment, or the fly in the ointment, the flaw in the model was, if we hit a positive endpoint, positive trial, whether it was a preclinical study or a clinical study, what do we do with it? AstraZeneca wasn't committed to then advancing that drug forward just because it was positive. And so I think it was a group that continues in a different form today. But I think I was there during some of the most creative and exuberant time for that group, when we had fresh budget, fresh ideas. But I think the flaw in the model was, when our positives hit, the organization didn't know what to do with it. And that
Yeah.
was sort of why Corvidia started, because the IL-6 program had a lot of good scientific evidence for it. But the cardiovascular group at AstraZeneca, it was completely off the strategy for them. So we had to spin it out to move it forward. There's plenty of ideas that just unfortunately didn't go anywhere because they couldn't be spun out and they couldn't be spun in.
Yeah, and it's a greater problem than just the problem it was at AstraZeneca. Are you familiar with David Feigenbaum at Everycure?
Absolutely.
Familiar? I mean,
Absolutely.
it's a fascinating concept. I mean, here's a guy who had a rare disease that he functionally cured himself in an N of one trial by
Yes.
trying different things out, and now it's his life's mission
Yeah.
to repurpose drugs, to get a head start. But I imagine that in more organizations than AstraZeneca, that sort of functional hurdle would be the big hurdle to chase. Like, who wants to take this? Like, we think we've got something, we're not equipped, or we can't facilitate its development. Who wants it, right?
Yeah. Now, you're absolutely, Matt, right. It is an industry-wide problem, and it has been an industry-wide problem for over a decade. And there are success stories, to be clear, but those are the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, yeah. This is another nice segue to the next set of questions I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned that sort of got Corvidia off the ground. You went on to found Corvidia.
Yeah, I was founder and chief medical officer.
Yep. And we can talk about that for a little bit, but from Corvidia, you went on to let's see, you went on to well, that was acquired by Novo Nordisk, correct? So we were at Pandion before that, before Corvidia,
No,
or
so
was it the other way around?
it's the other way around. So Corvidia was acquired by Novo in 2021. Sorry, 2020. I was, and I'm holding my breath because that compound is now in phase 3 in a large cardiovascular outcome trial. And so we'll know in a couple of years whether that first foray, that first hypothesis, generated between myself and another scientist at AstraZeneca who founded Corvidia with me, actually will do patients any good. A hypothesis was hatched in 2012, and by 2026, maybe 2027, we should know if it actually bears fruit. But my hat's off to Novo for really seeing and believing our data and the promise of the drug. But in 2019, at the end of the summer 2019. I was asked by Alan Crane and Polaris to become CEO of Pandion Therapeutics.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is where I'm going with the questions. So, Corvidia was working in antibodies, and you went to Pandion, which was acquired by Merck for a couple $1 billion. They were an immune modulator company, and I'm interested in that story as well. But then the big question is, you went from there to Tome, which is cell and gene therapy. So now, like, you're checking off, you're checking off boxes in terms of modality, right? If you want to talk a little bit about the Pandion experience, that's great too. But the question I want to get to is, like, what is your I guess, rationale between modalities and indications in terms of what Rahul Kakkar decides he's going to do with his life next? Because you've got, like I said, you're kind of checking them all off right now.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So Corvidia was a biologics company. Pandion was a immune modulatory biologics company working in autoimmune disease, whereas obviously Corvidia was a biologics company working in cardiovascular disease. So a big shift in therapeutic area. But I think the theme here has been Corvidia was really a single asset company. Yes, there were a couple of other things we were working on, but functionally, the lion's share of the capital and why the company was acquired was the lead asset. I did try to make Corvidia a platform company. We had done some interesting work using human genetics to validate IL-6 as a target in cardiovascular disease. And we recognized that the way we did that validation was by triangulating the function of different genes. It wasn't a simple, like, nature has mutated this gene and that tells us it's really important in this disease. It was actually the triangulation of a pathway involving multiple different genes that led us to believe that IL-6 was going to be important in cardiovascular disease. And we had this idea that this is very, very complex, multidimensional biology that is very different than the linear reductionist biology that we usually prosecute. And would a computer program looking at transcriptional data allow us to find more evidence of nonlinear, multidimensional genetic mutations to validate other targets?
Mm-hmm.
It's effectively AI before we were calling it AI, right? This is back in like 2013, 2014.
Right.
We actually
but the idea was there's a platform potential there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we actually did some early work with a CRO that worked in early ML models, very, very early ML models, to try to mine publicly available transcriptional data to find more evidence of these multidimensional genetic mutations that nature's created that would validate certain targets. And the board wasn't supportive. We
Mm.
never actually resourced it beyond a couple $100,000 to do some pilot work. Um, and so when I got to Pandion, um, what attracted me about Pandion, other than the fact that yes, it was still in the world of immunity, right? My first company was immune mechanisms in cardiovascular disease. This was immune mechanisms across autoimmune disease. Um, I think a couple of things were attractive. One, fascinated by inflammation and immune mechanisms. Two, I got to work with one of the world's best drug developers, Joe Viney, a far better scientist than I am, which allowed me to really focus on the business side of the business,
Mm.
uh, because I was never going to be a credible scientist in her shadow by any means. Um, but that was a multi-asset company. We called it a platform company, but in the strictest sense, it wasn't a platform. It was more a protein design philosophy that had the potential to create multiple targets across numerous autoimmune disease. So single asset now to multi-asset.
Hmm.
And so when Pandion was acquired, I actually wasn't sure I was going to jump into another company, to be perfectly honest. I was like, maybe now is my time to go back to venture, which is where my heart was back in 2011 when I was doing that consulting slash intern work for Brian.
Yeah.
Uh, and then I saw the paper that underwrites what Tome has become coming out of MIT from our founders. And I realized, one, this is a true platform, but two, this technology solves the outside of delivery restrictions, solves the key technical limitations that we have today um, in the gene editing world. And I've never been a rare disease drug developer. I've never done cell and gene therapy before. Um, but I saw that this was an order of magnitude more in scale. So single asset, multi-asset, and now Tome is really a step forward into cell and gene therapy, right? Very, very broad pipeline.
Hmm.
But it also allowed me to do something that I wasn't really able to do at my first two companies, which was craft a truly productive and innovative culture within a company. My first company, I was not the CEO. Um, it was run by a commercial head. It was a small company, clinical stage. There wasn't a culture, to be sure. And in my second company, I was the second CEO of that company. There was a culture in place that was largely led by Joe, a phenomenally productive culture, but not one that I had much of a hand in crafting. So coming to Tome, it was a chance to work in with a technology that could truly revolutionize and move past the limitations of current cell and gene therapy tools, but also a chance to build a culture drawing from all of the lessons I had learned, both in biotech, but also in the clinic.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like you to hover there for a minute and maybe extrapolate some of those experiences that made you an effective culture builder. Um, because, you know, you mentioned a minute ago, you talked about like having an opportunity in one of your positions to take a break from the science and go build the business, right? And
Mhm.
that's a learned skill. You know, that's a learned skill, especially for someone who's coming out of the science world or the practicing world. So is culture building, right? Like, I mean, I've had enough experience with physicians to know that culture and bedside manner are maybe secondary on the list, which is fine. You know, hey, as long as you keep me alive and healthy, I don't care if you're a nice guy or not. I don't care if you give me a warm, fuzzy feeling or not. But what were some of the, I guess, more specific sort of points along this journey where come to Tome, you feel equipped to not just build a business, you learn that along the way, but also to build a unique and thriving culture?
So let's be clear, Matt. I don't feel equipped to be a physician, a CEO, or a culture builder at this point.
You're
I'm still
well,
learning.
you're a Renaissance man, you know? Yeah,
I'm still learning.
clearly.
Um, I think there are a couple of things. One, um, I've I've had some true challenges in my life along the way. Things in my family, things, my extended family, in my immediate family. Hell, just raising 3 kids is a challenge.
Yeah.
And I think that I always think about a tagline that is underneath the email, the personal email of one of my mentors. I mentioned a few of them so far: Brian Roberts, Alan Crane. But under the tagline of Michael Davidson, who was my first CEO at Corvidia and remains a friend and a true mentor to this day, is things work out the best for those who make the best of the way things turn out. And I think Michael also has seen some slings and arrows in his day. And I think, and I actually was sitting down with Brian a few weeks ago when I was in California over a cup of tea. And we were sort of aligning on this idea that one of the most dangerous things for the human mind is sycophancy. And one of the best things for the human mind is struggle. You learn the most about others and yourself when you're tested in some way, whether it's a difficult relationship, whether it's the unknowns of raising a child, whether it's a difficult patient in their family who are really struggling with the disease. I've had a lot of struggles in my life, I think, both personally and just being a physician in the realm of cardiology, where nearly every time I practice medicine, someone is passing away. I mean, cardiovascular is serious disease.
Yeah.
And just having to learn more about yourself and how people react to adversity, what brings out the best in them and what makes the worst even worse. And seeing that again and again in different realms. I think at some point, unless you stick your head in the sand, you can't come out of those experiences as an adult human being without recognizing that there are certain themes that bring the best out of people. And a lot of the words that we use to describe those themes are somewhat trite: compassion, genuineness, vulnerability. I mean, some of these are buzzwords today, but they're buzzwords for a reason. I have found that, and this is not me, this is really me in partnership with our chief of people here, who Tome would not be what it is without her hand on the cultural tiller, as it were. Without sharing that philosophy of, if you truly show up as genuine to individuals, unless they really have a personality issue, they'll generally be genuine back with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I was going to say some of those, what you're referring to, buzzwords, totally get that. But I think they're no longer buzzwords when they're demonstrable, right? Like when they're demonstrated